Hello, welcome back to the channel. Before we continue, I just wanted to ask, if you're not subscribed, please consider subscribing. It really helps our channel, and it would be great to see you back here more often. So let's get onto it. Hello, Miri here. Here's a recap of what we watched in this episode. The Fellowship have entered the mines of Moria. Gandalf shows them the mithril that the dwarfs had been mining. We had that moment between Gandalf and Frodo when they talk about the pity of Bilbo, and Frodo wishes that the ring had never come to him. Gandalf then follows his nose. Gimli cries at the tomb of Balin. Pippin makes a kind of stupid decision, which leads to they have a cave troll. And then Frodo gets stabbed, but he's got his mithril vest on. We saw mithril come up in that clip, and we saw earlier Bilbo give Frodo the mithril vest. Gandalf says that the main thing that the dwarfs were digging was mithril. What do you think mithril signifies?
Well, it's a precious metal, precious resource, very timely these days to be thinking about rare earth minerals. I think it's got a contemporary and a more mythical aspect to it, and possibly other things as well.
Yeah.
The contemporary aspect must have been, I assume, to do with the Industrial Revolution, the legacy of that, the expansion of industry, wartime resourcing, looking for new materials, the development of new materials in Tolkien's lifetime, and I think there would have been an interest in that, I assume. So I don't think it's unconnected from that, and I think you even mentioned the Birmingham background and the idea of generating or discovering new metals, so I think there's that. I think because mithril is uniquely tough as a substance, it has a bit of a reference there to adamantine, which is a particularly tough material, as hard as diamonds, more or less. So there's that going on. The reference to diamonds I'm making also partly because diamonds, as I understand it, have existed in more or less the same form since the Big Bang. They're in very, very ancient form.
Yeah.
And I think there's something about mithril, perhaps because of the word itself, which is designed to evoke a particularly ancient geological substance that again refers back to the origin of time in some way, certainly the origin of earthly time and possibly the origin of astral time too. So there's all of that going on. And in addition to that, it is that which protects Frodo and saves his life, actually, in the form of this bulletproof vest that he's more or less wearing. It reminded me of Achilles. Achilles develops his immortality by being dipped in the substance, in the liquid, which keeps him immortal, apart from famously his heel, because in order to be dipped in substance he needs to be held, and that where he's held is the site of vulnerability, his heel. So I think Frodo in that respect, in relation to the mithril, becomes our kind of Achilles, the warrior, the hero. So there's a bit of a Homeric reference, I think, going on there. But at the same time, although Achilles is therefore protected, he's also vulnerable. So I think, although there's that anxiety when he is attacked that Frodo won't survive, and then we see him surviving, I don't think it removes the doubt, certainly from my mind, that he's potentially still vulnerable in the future.
Yeah.
Mithril can protect him, but not 100%. There will remain a vulnerability about him as we go on through the film. And after all, this is the second time he's been apparently mortally wounded and survived. And so both as the bearer of the ring and perhaps as Frodo in his semi-leader, quasi-leader role, he is all the more of a target, as you were saying before we started filming, for enemy forces.
Yeah.
So even though he might avail himself of things like mithril, and the ring and all sorts of other things, he seems to carry a persistent vulnerability to him. And I think that's borne out by his hobbit-like character,
Yeah.
which retains an innocence even as he accrues these more kind of manly attributes and warrior scars and so on. So I think that, yeah, there's a lot going on in the notion of mithril. The word mithril is, I mean, like a lot of the language here is evocative, but the ill reminded me of amyl and amyl nitrate and things. It sounds a little bit chemical, doesn't it, as well as geological.
Yeah, and it's quite it sounds kind of ethereal as well.
It does a little bit, and it's got the word myth in it.
Yeah.
Too. Yeah.
And what did you think of the city, the dwarf city?
Well, my first association with that was with Atlantis.
Yeah.
Because here they are stumbling upon an apparently lost kingdom of some kind. You can imagine people first stumbling upon, I don't know, Machu Picchu or something if you hadn't seen it before. And I think there is quite a strong strain here of small c colonial discovery. I'm not saying it's colonialist, but there is, I think, a bit of a sense of we've come upon these other civilizations which were lost and now we're discovering them, quote unquote, for the first time. Atlantis, of course, is the lost city of the classical era that may or may not have existed and has a mythical status, possibly located somewhere in the Mediterranean, possibly somewhere else. But it has that quality, not just of a civilization that predates civilization, so lost to civilization in some way, and perhaps containing clues about a higher order civilization whose lessons and insights have subsequently been lost or abandoned when the city itself was abandoned in some way. So there's all of that going on, I think. Sorry, I'm distracted now by that.
12 seconds later.
Yeah, so with Atlantis, or with a reference, if it is a reference to Atlantis, we have the notion of a civilization before civilization, and the possibility that there was something more glorious, more evolved, more enlightened in some way than existed in the so-called civilizations which came afterwards.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting. And of course the fact that it's lost, which adds to a sense of awe and wonder. And it's not just that, I think. In that shaft of light we see illuminating the tomb upon which Gimli falls, I couldn't help seeing a very strong connection to the notion of the Egyptian tombs in that and the shafts of light, because we know of the excavations of Howard Carter, who was presumably more or less a contemporary of Tolkien's, I would have thought.
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit earlier. And Tolkien would have been presumably very aware of those advances, if that's the right word, in Egyptian archaeology. A reference to those shafts of light going through the tombs of the pharaohs, which were aligned with the planets and the stars, and were supposed to create a connection between earthly life and, again, astral life in some way. So I think there is an Atlantis reference there. I think there's an Egypt reference there. And in both cases, we have the sense of awe at prior civilizations which might have been closer to the source and the origin than we are. And with that, closer to an idea of a sacred truth in some way. And in fact, when Gimli does fall upon that tomb, and there's bits of Indiana Jones, I think, in the filming of that, there is also
Indiana. He's an actor in Indiana Jones as well.
Oh, is he?
Bad dates.
Yeah. There is, I think, also a bit of an association of falling upon the Ark of the Covenant, the ultimate truth, the inner sanctum, the Grail, the ultimate relic, and all of that. So, again, I mean, I made this point before, we're in a very elusive space here. It's not direct allegory, but it's hard not to be reminded of all of these things. And I think, once again, in this sequence, as in previous sequences, one's imagination is exercised quite strongly because of those links, I think,
Yeah.
to other myth, history, story, and so on.
Reminds me a bit of Newgrange at the winter solstice when the light comes through.
Yeah, and the light is, well, Gandalf was the first one to mention the light, and we see his face illuminated. And then we have Gimli rushing towards this tomb of the lost ancestor, like the tomb of the lost soldier or the lost hero, the fallen idol, perhaps, in some way, and then the inscription upon the grave, which Gimli experiences as a kind of sacred moment, and he's given space by the others to as it were, practice his own religion, if that's the right way of putting it, by the others, which I find interesting, because although this is now the Fellowship, and they have been united as a band or clan in some way, they do have their own gods and ancestors and histories and myths and so on.
Yeah.
And that's quite an interesting example of Gimli, who thus far hasn't been the most noble of the fellows, being afforded space to, in a way, grieve, actually, for this lost soul in his own lineage.
Yeah. What did you think of their different fighting styles? You saw them fighting together for the first time as a kind of band of brothers.
You did, and I suppose that's important in terms of the arc of the film, because they're only a fellowship insofar as that fellowship is tested in some way. And here it's tested physically, because they're attacked by the orcs and then the Incredible Hulk, or whatever the name is of the monster, the cave troll, which reminded me very much, by the way, of the filming of King Kong in the original movie of King Kong.
The Pete Jackson has directed a King Kong movie as well.
Oh, has he?
Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay, so he did the second one.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that would make sense. Maybe they were saving money on props. Borrowed one from earlier. So they are tested, and I think it's important that they are tested as a fellowship, and it's not just an in principle accord between these different constituencies, that they are now put to the test, and they fight as one. They have slightly different styles and skills and strengths and so on, but they are supporting one another, backing one another up in different ways. I mean, I couldn't help wondering why Gandalf, given he's a wizard, wasn't deploying some more wizardly skills during that. I mean, I don't know what the limit is of his abilities.
Yeah.
When we were approaching the mines of Moria and he had to decode the gates, we came up against one limit. He couldn't do it, but Frodo could. So we are, I think, getting used to the idea that he is a flawed wizard, certainly in a wizard probably past his prime. But I was a bit surprised that he couldn't pull out a trick or two at that point.
Yeah, I never thought about that before, actually, that he doesn't do anything wizardy in that scene.
Yeah, because
Frodo almost gets killed.
Yeah, and for the second time. And I was surprised about that in a way, because we've had the previous scene where he is wounded and has to be carried to Rivendell to be healed. And now it happens again. And I wondered, just from a dramatic point of view, whether that they peaked too soon with that. You know, he's been taken to the brink now twice.
Yeah.
And you know, I don't really want to criticize the film, but it's a bit like, well, he got through the first one, he's going to get through the second one. If there's a third one, it'll be fine too. So I did feel the dramatic tension was slightly lessened by the fact we'd already gone to the brink with him the first time round, his life was in danger. And we have this huge sigh of relief. So, yeah, I was a bit...
But also we do know that he's wearing the mithril.
And we know he's wearing the mithril. Yeah, true. But nevertheless, his life being put in danger to such an extraordinary degree is something I would have thought perhaps would be deferred until a bit later, that there would be antecedent, that it would be led up to a little more, I suppose.
Well, I mean, his life is put in danger quite a few times to come. So if you're sick of it now, it's going to happen a few more times.
Well, I'm not sick of it. I'm just surprised, I suppose, that it isn't measured a bit more. It isn't built up to a bit more, that we go straight into the life-threatening stuff quite early on.
Yeah, I mean, I just see that as testing the mithril. I don't know.
And it does test the mithril, and the mithril wins, you know.
Mm.
So he now has the ring, he has the mithril. So he's being equipped. There's an interesting moment there where Gandalf says something like, "There's more to this young hobbit than
Meets the eye.
meets the eye." I find that interesting because the way Gandalf says that, for me, was a little ambiguous. I couldn't work out whether Gandalf knows what that extra thing is that the hobbit has, that is giving him this divine luck, or whether he doesn't know and he himself is waiting to find out.
Yeah.
Because Frodo, okay, he's given the ring, he's given the mithril, which are extraordinary resources, although we know the ring is ambiguous. Mithril's not particularly ambiguous, it's a defense.
But I guess he doesn't tell anyone about it.
No, and it's a
He
sort of
keeps it secret.
That's true. But there is a question about whether there is something special about Frodo over and above these tools and techniques that he has, whether he is actually the chosen one for another deeper reason in some way that might even be beyond Gandalf's own awareness. I think it's also interesting that we see Aragorn, who's thus far been so Zen-like almost in his presence, is himself now rattled in some way and clearly scared, I think, for his fellows and himself a little bit, as though his own limit has been tested. By contrast, actually, we see Boromir, I think, less sort of existentially shaken, perhaps more because he's in his element of warfare. He seems to be able to take it slightly more in his stride than Strider does.
And he's finding himself useful as well.
Yeah, and he's finding himself useful because it's a role that he's less of a square peg in a round hole, which he was a little bit before in fitting in with the Fellowship per se. So, and as I said before, Gimli finds a kind of nobility in this phase of the film. It wasn't quite with him.
Yeah, that's true.
Before, so we are seeing different aspects of different characters emerge. Legolas is a little bit bland, I think, during this phase. He's more of an observer than a participant in some ways.
Yeah, that's how I kind of see him. Like, he's very capable, but he's almost like an assistant, like a really good assistant. You know, like, you go into workplaces and the deputy manager basically does all the work that the manager does.
Yes.
So, like, he could easily take down that troll by himself.
He occupies, to use a fancy word, quite a liminal position in a way, because he's a little bit meta in his presence. What's his race again? What's his...
He's an elf, but he's from a different... He's a
strain of elves.
He's actually a prince. Yeah, he's Prince of Mirkwood.
Because the elf quality perhaps is that which gives him a slightly non-participatory quality to him. Like he's in a slightly different time zone or world or something, which is fine if it's elf-like. But it also raises a bit of a question. Well, if this is a fellowship, how much are you in it or not in it? Are you really just patrolling the boundary of it in some way? Are you a protective character or not a protective character? So there's something interesting, because with Arwen, who's an elf, right?
Yeah.
We saw her actively helping and recruiting her father to help, and of course committing herself to Aragorn in a very profound way. With Legolas at this point, I think it's certainly in my mind there's a question of what his value is to the group.
Well, I think his value is brawn.
Right, but he doesn't particularly display that.
I think he's probably the most effective,
skilled
fighter, like just with his arrows. Like,
yeah, okay.
He picks up on messages like, we shouldn't linger here. Like, I think he's picking up on like you said, I think he's plugged into something wider, which probably restrains him from being too in it. And he also doesn't have the same struggles that people like Boromir have, or Aragorn, or...
That's true. He doesn't seem to be of this world in quite the same way, and therefore not affected with those mental issues.
But with Boromir, like you said, yeah, he seemed more in his element. He was the first to close the door.
They have a cave troll.
Like he knows what to do.
He knows what to do.
I mean, you're right to say Legolas does. He's working with the arrows, isn't he? It seemed arrows, by the way, I was surprised to see arrows because they seem like such a flimsy defence in so many ways, but in fact they're quite effective.
What did you think of the scene between Gandalf and Frodo, seeing it the second time round?
Yes, of course, now I've got a bit of the backstory, so I understand more about what's going on. And I think we're continuing now that redistribution of power, because very early on in the film, right at the beginning, Frodo is this ingenue and Gandalf is the wise wizard who knows everything. By now that's not completely changed, but it's quite clear that Gandalf is the avuncular facilitator of things, but is now standing behind Gandalf effectively as a resource rather than leading him forward, and is almost ready to learn from Frodo himself, actually. And the fact that, as you say, Frodo had taken this decision slightly secretly to wear the mithril, I think plays into that notion that now it's Frodo with the one who is the one with the secrets and a bit more guile, perhaps. Whereas thus far, Gandalf had had the kind of monopoly over guile. Although there is still that phrase where Gandalf says, follow your nose. So he's still coming up with these tips, I suppose, based upon long experience that Frodo is not quite capable of yet, but is amassing all the more.
Frodo kind of breaks down a bit. We see him in earlier scenes say to Bilbo, I'm not like you. Here we see him say, I wish this had never happened to me.
Yeah, and I think that's important from a narrative point of view, the reluctant hero, because it's easier to identify with a reluctant hero. There's less ego about them. We want to encourage them. We feel a bit of sympathy for them and so on. So I think it's important for us to be reminded that the hero is a reluctant hero. And I was thinking during that of, this is I know, a very far-fetched reference, but I was thinking of an essay by Francis Bacon, the Renaissance philosopher and thinker, where he talks about success and how success is much more easy to get behind when it's somebody who hasn't been seeking success, actually, because then it too easily tips over into ambition. Yeah. And Frodo's not ambitious, which is interesting, whereas you could say Boromir, for example, is maybe a little bit ambitious. Yeah. So it's his ambitionlessness, which in a way is characteristic of him. I mean, he's ambitious for the group and he wants to do the right thing, but he's not personally ambitious.
And he's becoming quite stoic.
He is becoming quite stoic, and he's associated with these life-defining moments, existential moments, loss of life. We also have the two moments of slow motion when his life is in danger and Gandalf looks down. We had a little moment of slow motion earlier on the mountain as well when their life was in danger. So it seems slow motion is deployed when there's to use an existential word, an ontological question here about the status of being, the very being for people involved, which is an interesting device because by slowing the being down, we're looking at almost, when you see something pixelated, the units of its composition as though they could be disaggregated and being itself would fall apart. So I don't think it's an unsuccessful use of slow motion.
Yeah, that's quite an interesting observation, because when you think of movies today, there's so much slow motion used. Like, you just have loads of full-on scenes, which is just slow-mo. So I hadn't thought of that before, that it is used definitely in certain moments.
Yeah, well, it seems to be used in my language in moments of, and again, apologies for the slightly over-the-top phrasing, but in moments of ontological jeopardy, when being is being taken apart, or its structure is being broken down almost to the point of disappearance.
And time slows down.
Time slows down, and not just that, but I'm assuming that the frames per second when this was filmed would be fewer than the frames per second if we were to take slow-mo now. In other words, it's slightly more juddery, ever so slightly more juddery than it would be in modern day slow-mo, where it would be a smoother looking process. I'm just guessing at that. I don't know.
No, I think that's true. And I think that's why I don't get along with the Hobbit movies, because it's so crisp, and so I think they shot it in even more frames per second, so it's very high definition.
Yeah.
And whereas with this movie, there is a kind of filter over the top that helps with when you're looking at, you know, magical stuff. It gives the magic.
And I wonder, because there's a greenish tinge, I think, throughout in the mines of Moria as well, which I think, well, to me at least, suggested something a bit alchemical, or yes, deep in the earth, or something like that.
The music, I wanted to ask you about the music, because I saw this movie live with the orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall, and when it got to that moment when they're fighting, and the music stopped, it was really it was really weird, because you realise how much music is used throughout the film. And I don't know if that's the first time the music stops, but it felt like that was the first time the orchestra actually stopped playing up until that moment. And obviously this is like an hour and a half in, 2 hours in.
Yeah, that's a very interesting observation. And I suppose it is to signal a few things. One is that this is a moment of crisis where we don't need the music to remind us of that. I mean, music in film scores often serves as a guide to the viewer as to what the emotion is to be felt at a given point in time. And there is a lot of score in this film. I mean, I'd have to go back and re-watch it, but my theory is, and I could be completely wrong, and no doubt somebody will correct me on the comments, my theory is there's a lot of score at the beginning and end of films, even over dialogue, to signal we're beginning, and now we're beginning to end a moment of the film, to help us carry through and structure those emotional moments. But yeah, it's interesting what you say. So I assume it's because of that, because the fighting is of itself dramatic enough. It doesn't need extra musical furnishing.
Which almost is the opposite to a lot of action movies, where the action has a lot of music to back it up. But my favourite musical part in that section, which was amazing when I saw it live, was when Gandalf lights his staff and they show the city, and it's quite a euphoric moment of music. And watching that live, it was amazing.
Euphoric is exactly the right word, I think. I like that a lot. By now, I think, I mean, we're well into the film now, even halfway. It feels like the repertoire is now set. We have the different modes. We have the church-like polyphony, particularly associated with Saruman and Sauron, slightly menacing, deep bass male voices. We have that. We have the lilting, slightly folkloric tones, are particularly associated with the hobbits. To me, there's a lot of Vaughan Williams as well that's used around that in the more uplifting parts of it. And then we have this slightly more bombastic Sturm und Drang Wagnerian style. I did think, not in this phase but in the previous phase, whether there was a little bit of Prokofiev in there as well. I think there's Holst. I mean, I don't know who it's Howard Shore, isn't it? The person who wrote the score. I have no idea who his references would be, but those are the ones that sound to me that I can just about detect. And of course, but he makes the score his own, and it feels like it has an identity as a musical piece, doesn't it? Not just as a background to the film. I mean, it's almost as strong, actually, as Bernard Herrmann's scores for Hitchcock, which are very clearly aligned with the Hitchcockian aesthetic and mood. And it's almost impossible to think of this film now without that music or a different composer.
Yeah, I think it would, for me, it's just they're so in tune with each other. I think the movie really, I think the score just makes the movie even better. I mean, who knows? Like with a different score, who knows? But
yeah, the more up-to-date example I'd think of, which isn't a film but a TV series, would be Succession, where the musical score is so intrinsic to the action, and the motifs are so brilliantly adapted to the different situations. That fusion of hip-hop with classical seems to be part and parcel of the overall quality and nature of the TV program. And I think you're right here. It's woven into it. It's not background. It's part of it. It's almost like a character in and of itself.
Yeah.
Almost like a chorus would be in Greek drama, is it?
Yeah.
Sort of comments on what's going on.
When I think about it now, and I think of how powerful a really good score is, when I think of Game of Thrones. So I think the music in Game of Thrones is amazing, but as you get to the later seasons and the quality of the show starts to go down, the score still actually starts to get a bit better. Like the composer is obviously, I think he's quite young, but he's obviously developing. I think the only reason why it didn't go down sooner is because the score really held together some scenes and some pieces of action, and I think the score really does. I mean, it can make a bad movie good in a way.
Maybe, yeah.
Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you in the next one, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the notification bell. Thank you.